The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when Thomas Callahan, a rugged and stoic rancher, stumbled upon a sight that would forever be etched into his memory. As he guided his weary horse down the dusty trail that snaked through his land, the golden rays of dawn painted the rolling hills in hues of copper and rose. It was then that his gaze caught a figure in the distance, a lone cross standing at the edge of a withered meadow, silhouetted against the morning light. With a jolt of disbelief, Thomas spurred his horse forward, his heart pounding like the hooves against the earth, dust rising in swirls around him. He drew closer, and the sight stopped him cold. A young woman, no more than 20, was bound to the rough wood of the cross, her wrists and ankles lashed with fraying rope. A crude sign dangled from a nail above her head, its words burned into the weathered wood in harsh, mocking letters. "Come back when you're perfect." Her hair, a tangled mass of dirt and tears, shimmered in the early light, and her eyes, a shade of blue so vivid they seemed to pierce his very soul, flickered open as he approached. She was conscious, though barely, her lips cracked and trembling as she whispered something he couldn't quite hear. Thomas's chest tightened with a surge of anger and protectiveness he hadn't felt since his wife, Mary, passed away years before. Carefully, he dismounted, every movement deliberate as he approached her with hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice deep and steady, the voice that had soothed skittish cattle and broken horses. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her head sagged forward, a soft sob breaking past her lips. He could see the bruises that marred her skin, the raw scrapes where the rope had bitten too deep. With a flick of his knife, he cut her bonds, catching her as she slumped forward like a rag doll. She was so light in his arms, all fragile bone and trembling flesh, and as he cradled her to his chest, Thomas realized how long it had been since he'd held someone close. The girl's breath came in ragged gasps, and he pressed his ear to her lips, catching the faintest whisper of a name, Emmeline. He said it back to her, tasting the shape of it, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. "You're safe now, Emmeline," he promised, though he had no idea how he'd make it true. He carried her to his horse, wrapping her in his worn duster to shield her from the morning chill. She was so weak that she couldn't hold herself upright, and he rode with one arm around her, guiding the horse with the other, every step of the journey back to his homestead a silent prayer. When he reached his cabin, he laid her gently on his bed, the scent of old cedar and wood smoke filling the air. Emmeline's eyes fluttered open again, and Thomas saw the flicker of fear and confusion there. He knelt by her side, brushing the matted hair from her forehead with a tenderness that surprised even him. "You're safe," he repeated, though the words felt fragile in the face of the bruises that told a story he could only guess at. In the dim light of the cabin, he fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, gently wiping the dirt and blood from her skin. Every wince she made cut into him like a blade. Each soft whimper a vow he made in his heart to never let her be hurt again. When he finished, she looked almost like a girl again, though the haunted look in her eyes remained. He offered her water, and she drank it greedily, the cool liquid running down her chin. She tried to speak, but her voice was hoarse and broken. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Her eyes darted away, and she shook her head, the words locked away behind the trauma she carried. Thomas didn't press her. He knew what it was to carry burdens too heavy to share. Instead, he focused on caring for her, boiling a pot of broth and coaxing her to drink spoonfuls until some color returned to her cheeks. As the day wore on, Emmeline drifted in and out of sleep, her small body racked by shivers that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. Thomas sat by her side, his rough hands wrapped around hers, willing her to feel the strength he offered in silence. His mind kept returning to that sign. "Come back when you're perfect." The cruelty of it gnawed at him like a coyote at a carcass. Who could be so heartless as to leave a girl to die, bound and broken, because she failed to meet some impossible standard? The more he thought about it, the more his jaw clenched, a slow burn of fury lighting in his chest. Thomas was no stranger to pain. He'd lost his wife to fever, buried her beneath the oak tree behind the house. He'd thought his heart had died with her, but as he watched over Emmeline, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't dared feel in years. The need to protect, to shelter, to mend what was broken. When night fell, he lit a fire in the hearth and wrapped Emmeline in quilts that smelled of cedar and sun. He slept in the chair beside her, one hand resting on her arm, so she would know she wasn't alone. In the flickering light, he studied her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the delicate line of her brow. She was a stranger, yet he felt as if he'd known her all his life, as if some part of him had been waiting for her without even realizing it. When dawn came again, Emmeline woke with tears in her eyes, and this time she spoke. "I was a burden," she said in a voice as soft as a summer breeze. "He said I wasn't perfect enough, that I had to go back and fix myself before I was worth keeping." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "No one has the right to say that to you," he said, his voice low and fierce. She looked at him with those bright blue eyes, a flicker of hope fighting past the fear. "Why would you help me?" she asked. He thought of Mary, of the nights he'd spent alone in that cabin with nothing but his memories and the ghosts of what could have been. "Because you deserve better," he said simply. "Everyone does." In the days that followed, Emmeline grew stronger, though she still carried the weight of her past like a shadow. She never spoke of the man who had left her there, but Thomas saw the way her eyes flinched at sudden sounds, the way she pulled away from his touch until she remembered that he was safe. He worked the ranch by day, fixing fences and tending the cattle, always coming back to find her watching him through the window, her expression a mixture of wonder and wariness. Each evening, he would sit with her by the fire, telling her stories of the land, of the wild horses that roamed the hills and the storms that swept in like thunderous giants. Slowly, the walls she'd built around herself began to crack, and she would smile, small, fleeting smiles that lit up her whole face and made his heart ache with a sweetness he'd thought he'd lost forever. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. He would not let her go back to the cross, to the sign that said she wasn't perfect. He would show her that she didn't have to be perfect to be loved, that the scars she carried were proof of her strength, not her worthlessness. And as he watched her begin to blossom in the quiet safety of his home, Thomas felt something else awaken in him, a fierce, unshakable belief that perhaps, just perhaps, he could find healing too. As the days bled into weeks, the once silent cabin began to echo with the gentle rhythms of life, a fragile cadence that grew stronger with every sunrise. Thomas watched Emmeline's color return, her cheeks pinking in the cold mountain air, her eyes no longer dulled by fear, but flickering with cautious curiosity. She spent her mornings by the hearth, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts, her hands busy with mending clothes or stirring pots of stew, her soft humming weaving itself into the quiet of his home. And though she rarely spoke of her past, her silences no longer felt like barriers. Thomas had always been a man of few words, his life measured in the simple truths of the land, the call of a red-tailed hawk, the groan of the wind through the pines, the crackle of the fire at night. He did not need to pry to know that Emmeline was fighting battles within herself, that each smile was a small act of defiance against the darkness that had once claimed her. When the snow began to fall in soft white drifts, Emmeline took to wandering the ranch with Thomas, her steps growing surer as she learned to read the land beneath her feet. She walked beside him as he checked the fences, her fingers trailing along the rough wood, her breath fogging in the cold air. Sometimes she would stop to watch the cattle, their heavy bodies moving with patient dignity, or she would stand at the edge of the ridge, her eyes drinking in the endless expanse of sky. "It's beautiful here," she said one morning, her voice almost lost in the sigh of the wind. Thomas glanced at her, his eyes tracing the delicate line of her profile, the way her hair, still unkempt and wild, tumbled around her shoulders. "A man can lose himself in it," he said quietly. She looked at him then, her gaze steady and searching. "Is that why you stay?" The question lingered in the cold air, and Thomas found himself turning away, his gloved hands tightening around the reins of his horse. "Maybe," he admitted, "or maybe I stay because I've got nowhere else to go." Emmeline nodded, as if she understood that feeling better than most. In those moments, Thomas saw a strength in her that belied the scars she carried, a quiet resilience that spoke of battles fought and survived. He admired her for it, even as he feared the weight of what had been done to her. The sign, that cruel, hateful sign, haunted him still, a specter that hovered in the back of his mind. He'd burned it the day after he found her, reduced it to ash, and scattered it in the wind. But the words had left their mark on Emmeline, etched into the way she flinched at praise, the way she hesitated before accepting a kindness. She'd been told she wasn't perfect, and some part of her still believed it. Thomas knew better. Perfection was a lie, a shimmering mirage that vanished when you drew near. He had loved and lost enough to know that it was the flaws that made a person worth loving, the cracks where the light got in, the scars that told the story of survival. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Emmeline came to him in the barn, her hands buried deep in the pockets of his old coat. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice trembling like a fawn on unsure legs, "I want to know why you're alone." He set down the saddle he'd been oiling, wiping his hands on a rag as he met her gaze. "My wife died," he said simply. "Years ago. Fever took her, quick and cruel." Her eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her fingers brushing the worn leather of the saddle. "I'm sorry," she murmured. He shook his head. "She was the light of my life. I thought when she was gone, there was nothing left worth living for. So I stayed here with the cattle and the sky, because it was easier than facing a world without her." Emmeline's hand came to rest on his arm, her touch light and hesitant. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she whispered. The words struck something deep in Thomas, something he hadn't dared to acknowledge. He'd buried himself in the rhythms of ranch life, in the quiet certainty of dawn and dusk, but in Emmeline's touch, he felt the first flicker of hope. They spent that night in the cabin, the fire crackling low as they talked about everything and nothing, the places she'd seen, the dreams he'd once had. She told him of the man who had tied her to that cross, how he'd promised her the world and then shattered it piece by piece. He said I was too much, she said, her voice so soft he had to lean close to hear. Too loud, too stubborn, too everything. He said he'd love me when I was perfect. Thomas felt a cold rage stir in his gut, but he kept his voice gentle. "You're not too much, Emmeline," he said. "You're exactly enough." Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms, holding her as she cried. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't just offering her shelter or safety. He was offering her a place in his heart, a chance to heal together. As winter deepened, the world outside turned to a silent white hush, but within the cabin, warmth bloomed. Emmeline began to laugh again, the sound low and musical, like the first notes of spring. She baked bread in the old cast-iron stove, her laughter echoing through the small space as Thomas teased her about the flowers streaked across her cheek. She read the few books he had, her voice soft and measured as she traced the words with her finger, and at night she would curl up by the fire with a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, her hair gleaming in the flickering light. And Thomas, he found himself smiling more than he had in years. He caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, his heart swelling with a tenderness that both thrilled and terrified him. He'd thought he was done with love, that his heart had turned to stone in the wake of Mary's death, but Emmeline was like spring rain on parched earth, coaxing forth green shoots of something new and alive. One night, as the wind howled outside and the snow beat against the windows, Emmeline came to him where he sat by the fire, her eyes luminous in the half-light. "Thomas," she said, her voice shaking, Do you think there's a place for someone like me? Someone who's broken?" He rose and took her hands in his thumbs brushing over the scars that told the story of her survival. "You're not broken," he said softly. "You're healing, and there's always a place for that." She leaned into him then, her forehead resting against his chest, and he felt her breath hitch in the quiet. Slowly, Carefully, he tipped her chin up and kissed her, a gentle brush of lips that spoke of all the things he hadn't yet found the words to say. It was a kiss that asked nothing, that offered only the simple truth of two souls finding solace in each other. When they parted, Emmeline looked at him with tears in her eyes, but she was smiling, a smile that lit up the shadows of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." He kissed her again, and this time it was an answer, not in words, but in the fierce, unspoken vow that he would never let her be left out in the cold again. In the days that followed, the ranch became a haven not just of survival, but of gentle beginnings. They worked side by side, mending fences and feeding the cattle, their laughter mingling with the sigh of the wind and the lowing of the herd. In the quiet of the evenings, they spoke of dreams, of a garden come spring, of wildflowers to plant in the meadow, of a life where neither of them had to be perfect to be worthy of love. Thomas knew that there would be hard days ahead, that healing was a slow and winding road. But as he watched Emmeline stand in the doorway of the cabin, the snowflakes catching in her hair like tiny stars, he felt a fierce certainty take root in his heart, that they had both been broken, but together they were enough. As the first thaw of spring loosened the icy grip of winter, Thomas and Emmeline found themselves standing at the edge of a new beginning, their hearts stitched together by the fragile threads of shared hope. The snow receded in slow, shimmering streams, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath, fertile ground for the seeds of the life they'd begun to dream of. The cattle lowed contentedly in the pasture, their breaths misting in the cool morning air, and the sun rose higher each day, painting the hills with the soft gold of possibility. In the mornings, Thomas would ride out to check the herd, the saddle creaking beneath him, the leather reins warm and familiar in his hands. Emmeline rode beside him now, her posture more confident, her eyes no longer wide with fear but alight with determination. She'd taken to wearing his old hat, the brim shading her face as she squinted into the distance, and he found that he loved the sight of her like that, strong and unafraid. They spoke little on those rides, content to let the quiet speak for them, the gentle clop of hooves on soft earth, a steady rhythm that calmed the restless ghosts in their hearts. Sometimes Thomas would catch her looking at him, her eyes full of questions she hadn't yet found the words for. And in those glances, he saw the woman she was becoming, someone who had clawed her way back from the brink and refused to be anything less than whole. One evening, as the sky blushed pink over the mountains, Emmeline took his hand and led him to the old barn, her steps sure and silent. "There's something I want to show you," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. She pushed open the door to reveal a small space she'd claimed for herself, a corner of the barn where she'd hung scraps of fabric and bits of wildflowers she'd gathered in the meadow. In the dim light, Thomas saw the careful stitches in the fabric, the embroidery that traced delicate patterns of leaves and stars, a testament to the patient, painstaking work of her hands. "I wanted to make something that was mine," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the cloth. Something that said, "I'm still here." Thomas felt his throat tighten as he reached out to touch the fabric, his calloused fingers brushing over the fine threads. "It's beautiful," he said simply, his voice low and rough. Emmeline looked up at him then, her eyes shimmering with tears, and in that moment, Thomas realized that this quiet corner of color and life, was her way of reclaiming herself from the shadows. It was her declaration that she would not be defined by the cruelty of others, that she would not let the darkness of the past blot out the light she carried within. In the days that followed, they began to speak more of the future, their conversations tentative at first, like seedlings pushing through the thawing earth. Emmeline spoke of wanting to plant a garden, of rows of bright flowers and hardy vegetables that would feed them through the seasons. Thomas listened, his heart swelling with the fierce, protective love he felt for her, and he promised her that they would make this place their own, brick by brick, seed by seed. But even as they dreamed of green shoots and blooming meadows, the past was never far behind. One night, as they sat by the fire, Emmeline spoke of the man who had left her tied to that cross, her voice quiet but steady. He said he'd come back for me, she said, her hands knotted in her lap. That he'd make me perfect, one way or another. Thomas felt a cold fury simmer in his veins, but he forced himself to breathe, to let her speak. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low and sure. "He won't find you here." Emmeline nodded, but he saw the shadow that lingered in her eyes, the fear that the past could reach out and claim her again. In the days that followed, he doubled his watchfulness, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a stranger, his rifle always within reach. And in those long, silent hours of waiting, Thomas realized that love was not just the soft, tender moments they shared. It was the fierce, unwavering determination to protect her, to build a life where she could be more than the sum of her scars. When the first green shoots of spring burst through the thawing earth, Emmeline knelt in the garden they'd cleared together, her hands sunk deep in the loamy soil. She planted each seed with reverence, her fingers gentle as she pressed them into the ground, and Thomas watched her, his heart swelling with a quiet, steadfast pride. In the evenings, they would walk the edge of the pasture, the soft hush of the wind in the grass their only witness. Emmeline would slip her hand into his, her fingers warm and sure, and in those simple touches, Thomas felt the weight of all they'd endured, the strength of all they'd yet to build. One night, as the moon rose full and bright over the hills, Emmeline turned to him, her eyes luminous in the pale light. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to stay here, with you. I don't want to run anymore." He took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. "Then stay," he said simply. "I'll be here, as long as you need me." In the quiet that followed, she leaned into him, her breath warm against his throat, and he held her like a man who'd found his anchor in a world that had once felt too wide, too empty to bear. They made love that night in the soft, flickering glow of the hearth, their bodies moving together with a gentle urgency that spoke of all the words they hadn't yet learned to say. It was not a claiming, but a promise that neither of them would ever again be left to face the cold alone. When morning came, Thomas woke to find her curled against him, her hair a soft tumble of gold across his chest, her breathing slow and even. Outside, the world was greening with the first flush of spring, and in that quiet dawn light, Thomas knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The past had left its scars, deep and jagged, but here, in this small, sturdy cabin, they had found something stronger than fear. They had found the simple, stubborn grace of survival, the quiet triumph of two souls who refused to be broken by the cruelty of the world. As they worked side by side in the days that followed, mending fences, planting seeds, laughing at the simple joys of a life hard won, Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known in years settle over him. It was not the easy peace of a life without struggle, but the fierce, hard-earned contentment of knowing that he had found someone who saw him not as a man broken by loss, but as a man remade by love. And in Emmeline's laughter, in the gentle strength of her hands, in the soft, sure warmth of her presence beside him, Thomas knew that they had both come back from the edge, and in doing so, they had found something more enduring than perfection. They had found each other,